Okay, so you want to understand the world of Orwell's 1984,
Yeah.
but um, maybe you haven't quite had the time to, actually sit down and read the entire book.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is a big one, and it can be, a little bit dense in parts.
Definitely.
So, but that's why we're here. We're going to do a deep dive into 1984.
Exactly.
And what's so interesting to me is like how much of what Orwell was writing about back then just seems so relevant now.
Oh, absolutely. He was really a visionary when it came to understanding the dangers of things like surveillance and, propaganda and thought control.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, Big Brother, watching your every move.
Right, and the whole idea that you can't even have your own thoughts without the party, knowing about it and possibly punishing you for it.
It's scary, and it's like he was writing about our world today in a way.
It is. It's really eerie how much of it resonates with, our current situation with social media and the internet and all of that.
So let's start with the basics, just to kind of set the stage.
Yeah.
We're in Oceania, right? This totalitarian state ruled by the ever-watchful Big Brother and the party.
Right.
And, one of the things that Orwell does so well is he creates this atmosphere of constant surveillance.
Oh, absolutely. The telescreens everywhere, the thought police always listening. It's enough to make you paranoid just thinking about it.
Right. And then there's this whole idea of thought control. You can't even think the wrong thing without the party, being aware of it.
Yeah, and the party controls every aspect of life in Oceania, from the news you consume to the language you speak, even to the history you're allowed to remember.
And this is where newspeak comes in, right? This attempt to limit thought by literally shrinking the vocabulary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The idea is that if you don't have the words to express a rebellious thought, you can't even think it.
Right. And Orwell gives us this great example with Syme, this character who's like a language expert. And he's almost gleeful as he's explaining how words like bad will be replaced with ungood and eventually disappear altogether.
And it's so chilling because you realize that the party is trying to control not just what people say, but what they're even capable of thinking.
And it's not just language. They're controlling, they're manipulating history. They're rewriting the past to fit their agenda.
Oh, absolutely.
And we see this play out in Winston's job at the Ministry of Truth, where he literally alters records.
Right. Like when they lower chocolate rations, but then claim they've actually increased them. It's just a constant barrage of propaganda and misinformation designed to keep the population confused and obedient.
And it makes you wonder how much of what we're told today is actually true. How much of it's just, spin and manipulation.
It's a really important question, especially in our current world, where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that Orwell does so well is he makes you question everything you know. He makes you think about the sources of information you trust and whether you're really getting the whole story.
And that's why 1984 is still so relevant today, because it forces us to confront these issues of surveillance and propaganda and thought control, which are more prevalent than ever in our digital age.
Okay, so we've got Big Brother watching, we've got thought police lurking, and we've got language itself being twisted.
Right, it's a pretty bleak picture so far.
But what about love and desire? Surely even the party can't control something as fundamental as that.
Well, you'd think so, but they certainly try.
Right, they push this idea of chastity. They see sex solely for procreation.
Any enjoyment of sex is deemed sex crime, and you can be punished for it.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to eliminate all forms of pleasure and individuality.
Exactly. They want to control every aspect of human experience, even the most intimate ones.
But then we meet Julia, right?
Oh, Julia.
This woman who's kind of like a breath of fresh air in this oppressive world.
She's rebellious, she's passionate, she's everything the party hates.
Right. And her relationship with Winston becomes this act of defiance against the party's control.
Mm-hmm. It's like their affair is this little pocket of freedom in this otherwise totalitarian state.
They have to sneak around, find hidden places to meet, because they know that if they're caught, the consequences will be dire.
But they're willing to take that risk because for them, love and desire are worth fighting for.
And it raises this really interesting question. Can love and desire truly exist under a system that seeks to erase individuality?
Right, because the party is trying to create this society where everyone is just a cog in the machine. No one has any individual thoughts or feelings or desires.
But Winston and Julia prove that those human impulses can't be completely suppressed.
They show that even in the darkest of times, there's still a spark of humanity that can't be extinguished.
And that's what makes their story so compelling, so hopeful in a way.
It's a reminder that even in the face of oppression, love and desire can still flourish.
So amidst all this oppression, is there any hope for rebellion? Is there any chance of overthrowing the party?
Well, Winston seems to think so, and he puts his faith in a surprising group, The proles.
The proles. These are the working class,
Hmm.
the vast majority of the population in Oceania.
Right, and Winston romanticizes them a bit. He sees them as less indoctrinated by the party, more connected to the past.
He even visits the prole district.
Mm.
He goes to a pub, he listens to their conversations, he buys a glass paperweight from an antique shop.
That paperweight becomes this symbol for him of a world before Big Brother, a world where beauty and individuality still existed.
Right, and he starts to believe that maybe the proles hold the key to overthrowing the party.
But that's where Orwell gets ambiguous.
Right, because while Winston idealizes the proles, are they truly capable of rebellion?
Are they aware enough of the party's control, or are they too consumed by their daily struggles and the distractions the party provides?
It's a question that hangs over their fate, and one that we'll have to explore further as we continue our deep dives into 1984.
Exactly. It's interesting because on the one hand, Winston sees this hope in the proles, but on the other hand, he also kind of acknowledges that they might be too caught up in their own lives.
Right, he even says something like, until they become conscious, they will never rebel. And until after they have rebelled, they cannot become conscious.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is, and it makes you wonder if Winston is really projecting his own desires onto the proles. He's looking for hope wherever he can find it.
And speaking of hope, Winston seems to find a glimmer of it in this mysterious figure, O'Brien.
Oh yeah, O'Brien, this inter-party member who Winston becomes convinced is part of the resistance.
Right, and it starts with this brief encounter in a hallway where O'Brien seems to give Winston this subtle signal of recognition.
It's all very cloak and dagger, right? And then later O'Brien invites Winston to his apartment.
Which is this super luxurious place, a stark contrast to Winston's own meager existence.
Yeah, and they drink this forbidden wine. They talk about Goldstein's book, The Manifesto of the Resistance.
It's all very exciting for Winston. He finally feels like he's found someone who understands him, who shares his rebellious spirit.
But here's the thing. Was O'Brien ever really part of the resistance, or was he playing Winston all along?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Orwell does a brilliant job of keeping us guessing.
Right, because there are definitely hints that O'Brien might not be who he seems.
Like when he says things that sound almost too good to be true.
Yeah, and there's this sense of unease that hangs over their interactions, like something's not quite right.
And of course, as we know, things do go very wrong for Winston and Julia.
Right, they get captured by the thought police.
And taken to the Ministry of Love, which is just the most Orwellian name ever.
Because there's no love there, only torture and brainwashing.
And Orwell doesn't shy away from depicting the brutality of the party's methods.
No, he really goes there, like the whole scene with the rats in Room 101.
Ugh, it's so disturbing, but also so effective in showing just how far the party is willing to go to break people.
And they do break Winston and Julia. They betray each other. They renounce everything they once believed in.
And it's heartbreaking to see how these two characters who were so full of life and defiance are reduced to empty shells of their former selves.
Right. They become just like everyone else in Oceania, completely subservient to the party.
And the final blow comes when Winston encounters Julia after they've both been released back into society.
And there's no recognition, no spark of their old love.
They've both been completely reprogrammed by the party.
And then there's that chilling last line of the book, he loved Big Brother.
It's just devastating, isn't it?
It is, because it suggests that the party has achieved total victory. They've completely crushed Winston's spirit.
And it makes you wonder if there's any hope at all in a world like that.
Right. Is resistance even possible, or is the party's control too absolute?
It's a question that Orwell leaves us to ponder, and it's one that's still relevant today as we face our own challenges to freedom and individuality.
It's tough, right? Like, you get to the end and you kind of want to believe that maybe somewhere deep down Winston still hates Big Brother.
Right, like maybe that last thought is just him trying to convince himself so he can survive.
Yeah, maybe there's still a tiny flicker of rebellion burning inside him.
It's possible. I mean, Orwell leaves it open to interpretation, which is part of what makes the ending so powerful.
Right, it makes you think about the limits of human endurance.
Yeah.
How much can a person take before they completely break?
And it makes you wonder if there's any point at which resistance becomes futile.
Right, because if even someone like Winston, who's so determined to fight back, can be broken, then what hope is there for anyone else?
It's a pretty bleak outlook.
But I also think there's a glimmer of hope in the very act of reading the book,
Oh, absolutely.
Because by understanding the dangers that Orwell is warning us about,
Yeah.
we can be more vigilant, we can resist those forces in our own lives.
Right, it's like a call to action, to be aware of the ways in which power can be abused and to fight against those abuses wherever we see them.
And one of the most important lessons, I think, is the power of language.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Orwell was really ahead of his time in understanding how language can be used as a tool of control.
Right, like Newspeak is the most obvious example. But he also shows how even seemingly innocuous words and phrases can be twisted to serve the party's agenda.
Right, like the whole idea of doublethink, holding two contradictory beliefs in your mind at the same time.
It's like the party is trying to make it impossible to even think clearly, to question their authority.
And it's something that we see happening in the real world too, right? The way that certain words and phrases are used to manipulate people to shut down debate.
Yeah, it's like Orwell is giving us a roadmap for how to recognize and resist those kinds of tactics.
And it's more important now than ever, with the rise of social media and the constant bombardment of information we're all subjected to.
Right. We have to be critical thinkers, we have to be skeptical of what we're told, and we have to be willing to speak out against injustice.
Absolutely, because if we don't, then we risk ending up in a world that looks a lot like Oceania.
A world where freedom is slavery and ignorance is strength.
And where war is peace.
So yeah, 1984 is a tough book to read. It's definitely not a feel-good story.
No, not at all.
But it's an important one, and I think it's one that everyone should engage with in some way.
I agree. It's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it, and it's a book that I think we can all learn from.
So for those of you who maybe haven't had the time to tackle the whole thing, I hope this deep dive has given you a taste of its power and relevance.
Yeah, and maybe it'll inspire you to go and check out the book for yourself.
And even if you don't, I think the important thing is to keep these ideas in mind, to be aware of the dangers that Orwell is warning us about, and to fight against them in whatever ways we can.
Exactly.
Because the future is not set in stone.
Yeah.
We have the power to shape it
Okay.
and to make sure that it doesn't become a dystopian nightmare like Oceania.
Right.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into 1984.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.